For 2 centuries, Egyptology has carried a question that nobody wanted to be the one to answer. Not archaeologists, not historians, not geneticists. The question of who the ancient Egyptians actually were, genetically and biologically, had become so entangled with politics, identity, and the weight of colonial history that most researchers treated it the way you treat a live wire. You acknowledge it exists, you do not touch it. Then, in 2017, a team of researchers extracted ancient DNA from Egyptian mummies and published the most comprehensive genomic analysis of ancient Egyptians ever attempted. The results did not simplify the argument. They resolved one question entirely and opened several more. What the DNA revealed connected ancient Egypt to a world that modern assumptions had consistently underestimated. And it forced a reckoning with how much of what we think we know about the ancient Mediterranean was built on foundations nobody had ever actually tested. The problem started with the mummies themselves. Egypt possesses some of the most extraordinary preserved organic material anywhere on Earth. Tens of thousands of mummies spanning millennia, each one a potential archive of biological information. And for decades, every serious attempt to extract usable ancient DNA from them failed. Early studies that claimed to recover ancient Egyptian DNA made headlines and were subsequently shown to have been contaminated. The researchers' own genetic material, or DNA, introduced across centuries of excavation and museum handling, had corrupted the ancient signal beyond recovery. Here is why the contamination problem was so severe. DNA degrades after death, attacked by bacteria, moisture, and chemical processes that accelerate in warm environments. Egypt's climate, hot and arid at the surface, was exactly wrong for long-term genetic preservation. The mummification process itself, with its resins, natron salts, and extended heat exposure, introduced additional chemical damage that fragmented whatever genetic material the climate had not already destroyed. By the early 2000s, the scientific consensus had hardened into something close to resignation. Reliable ancient DNA from Egyptian mummies was probably unrecoverable. The mummies would remain biologically silent. That consensus turned out to be wrong. The Abusir el-Meleq site in Middle Egypt had been excavated by German archaeologists between 1902 and 1906. The mummies recovered there had been housed in European museums ever since, well catalogued, relatively well preserved, representing a continuous population spanning from roughly 1400 BCE to 400 CE, over 1,400 years of burials from a single location. A longitudinal sample that, if it could be read genetically, would offer something unprecedented, a picture of continuity or transformation across more than a millennium of Egyptian history covering the late New Kingdom, the Third Intermediate Period, the Late Period, and the Roman occupation, dynasty after dynasty, conquest after conquest, all recorded in the same cemetery. In 2017, an international team led by Verena Schuenemann at the University of Tübingen and Johannes Krause at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History published what they had found. The methodology was more rigorous than anything previously attempted on Egyptian material. Samples were processed in dedicated ancient DNA cleanroom facilities. Modern contamination was tested for, tracked, and controlled at every stage. The team recovered mitochondrial genomes from 90 of the mummies and genome-wide data from 3. Not a large sample by the standards of modern genomics, but enough to establish a clear genetic signal, and clear enough to answer the question that 2 centuries of Egyptology had been circling. Here is the detail that stopped me when I first read the study. The ancient Egyptians showed no significant genetic connection to sub-Saharan African populations. Their profile placed them squarely within the ancient Near Eastern world, closely related to populations from the Levant, from Anatolia, from the broader Fertile Crescent region. The closest living parallels were populations from modern Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and Syria, not populations from further south, not populations from deeper into the African continent. The ancient Egyptians, genetically, were a Mediterranean and Near Eastern people. This requires careful unpacking because the debate it intersects is not a neutral one. For more than a century, a contested argument has run through Egyptology. Were the ancient Egyptians African in the sense that 19th and 20th century racial categories applied that word, meaning primarily connected to sub-Saharan populations? Or were they more closely related to populations to the north and east? The argument carried enormous political stakes because ancient Egypt represented one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history, and who got to claim it as an ancestor had never been a purely academic question. It was a question about legitimacy, about which modern populations could look back at the pyramids and the temples and the written record and say, "Those were our people." The 2017 DNA data did not enter this debate gently. What the genomes showed was that across the entire 1,400-year period sampled at Abusir el-Meleq, the ancient Egyptian population showed strong genetic continuity. Dynasty after dynasty, conquest after conquest, Persian, Macedonian, and eventually Roman rule all passed through without substantially altering the genetic composition of the population being studied. The ancient Egyptians absorbed conquerors politically without being replaced biologically. Their core ancestry remained anchored to the ancient Near East throughout the entire sample period, and remained stable in a way that most other populations in the region, subjected to the same waves of migration and military movement, did not. The comparison to modern Egyptians produced the finding that generated the most discussion after the study was published. Modern Egyptians share the same basic ancient Near Eastern ancestry as their ancient predecessors, but carry approximately 8% more sub-Saharan African ancestry than the ancient population showed. The researchers attributed this to increased contact and population movement across the Sahara over the past 1,500 years, particularly associated with the trans-Saharan trade networks and the slave trade that connected North Africa to sub-Saharan populations during the medieval and early modern periods. This is not a story of replacement, it is a story of continuity with incremental, historically traceable addition. Here is why that matters beyond the political argument. What the finding reveals is a population that was remarkably stable for over a millennium and then absorbed a measurable but modest external genetic input in a more recent, historically identifiable period. That pattern is itself significant. While the genetic landscape of Europe was being written and rewritten by successive waves of migration, Bronze Age steppe pastoralists, Roman-era movements, medieval population shifts, the ancient Egyptian population at Abusir el-Meleq held its shape across the same centuries with unusual consistency. Pull back from the Egyptian case and consider what it means for how we understand the ancient Mediterranean world. The Levantine ancestry profile that defines the ancient Egyptians is the same ancestral foundation that underlies the Phoenicians, the early Bronze Age Canaanites, the populations of ancient Israel and Jordan. The Mediterranean's eastern shore and the Nile Delta were not two separate worlds with two separate genetic histories. They were expressions of the same underlying population base, differentiated by geography, language, and culture, but sharing deep common ancestry reaching back to the Neolithic farmers who spread across the region thousands of years earlier. Ancient Egypt was not an isolated African civilization surrounded by genetically unrelated neighbors. It was an integrated node in a connected Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, genetically enmeshed with the very populations that appear in its own historical records, as trading partners, diplomatic correspondents, military rivals, and occasional conquerors. This reframes the question that Egyptology has been asking for 200 years. The argument over whether ancient Egypt was African or Mediterranean was always a false binary, imposed by the racial categories of the 19th century onto a world that operated by entirely different logics. The ancient Egyptians were geographically African. Their core ancestry traced back to Near Eastern populations. These two facts are not in conflict. They are simply the genetic reality of a population that had been in its location, at the intersection of Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Levant, for thousands of years. I came across the Schuenemann study while reading about methodological advances in ancient DNA extraction, and what struck me was not the headline finding, but the quieter implication underneath it. The reason it took until 2017 to answer a question that Egyptology had been carrying since the 19th century was not a lack of mummies. Egypt has more well-preserved ancient remains than almost anywhere on Earth. The reason was technical. The same hot, dry environment that preserved the bodies destroyed the molecular evidence inside them. The answer was always there. The climate had been hiding it. What the methodological breakthrough at Tübingen and Leipzig demonstrated was that even the most chemically hostile ancient DNA environments were not permanently impenetrable. Teeth and petrose bone, the densest bone in the human skull, provided enough protection against thermal and chemical degradation to yield usable sequences from material that had previously been written off as unreadable. The picture is still forming. The Abusir el-Meleq sample covers one site, one region, one slice of Egyptian society across a defined time period. What the DNA of a New Kingdom pharaoh might show, or the populations of Upper Egypt further south, or the peoples of the Nile's first and second cataracts, these remain largely unread. Each sample will add texture to a picture that is already more complex and more interesting than the simplified versions that 2 centuries of contested Egyptology had produced. What the 2017 study established definitively was that the ancient Egyptians were Mediterranean people in the fullest genetic sense of that phrase, connected to the Near East, genetically continuous across foreign occupation and dynastic change, distinct from, though related to, the modern population that lives in the same geography today, and entirely capable of having built what they built without that fact requiring any external explanation. The civilization that gave the world monumental architecture, medical knowledge, agricultural engineering, and one of the earliest writing systems was a Near Eastern, Mediterranean, African population doing what complex civilizations do, absorbing, building, and enduring. The DNA doesn't mythologize them. It simply confirms they were exactly what the evidence had always suggested: real, continuous, and far more connected to the world around them than the long argument over their origins ever gave them credit for being.